when Khushwant was at the Illustrated Weekly, he was the first editor who ever published my poems. So this one is one that I wrote for him. Acid-tongued mischief maker, spotlight stealer, story stalker, salt in the wound, piss taker, punchline grabbing, headline hogger. Not nice, not a nice man to know. Spit in the eye, straight talker, shaker upper, elbow in the ribs, ego breaker, bawdy, shameless, gossip monger, whiskey guzzling, guzzle lover. Not nice, not a nice man to know. Of all the Sikhs he was seeker, pricker of pride, poker, and pecker away at the accepted order, sparing neither man nor God, not nice to know, not a nice man at all. Half his heart in Lahore, half in Amritsar, 1 foot in Delhi, 1 in the gutter, son of a gun, and says Soba Singh, malice towards one and all. If you're not expected, don't ring his bell. If you expect to be respected, go to hell. Not a nice man to know, I know. But I wish that I had known him longer. And I wish there were more like him in the world. Not nice to know, but they don't grow on trees, people like him. So it's worth remembering Khushwant Singh. Not nice, but he took us all under his wing. The young, the outspoken, the runaways, the rebels and poets, the broken things. And this is why we gather to sing of him, while he's laughing up there in the place he didn't believe in, drinking a peg or 3 with the boss, who's still not the boss of him. So here's to the man who we know is not nice to know, but we want to know and go on knowing. Khushwant, Khushwant, Khushwant Singh.
Very good. Very good.
Welcome to you all tuned in for this session. Benazir, my friend, with Victoria Schofield and Javed Jabbar in conversation. Thank you, Ashwani, who's behind the scenes managing the session. And of course, thanks and congratulations to Nilofer and Raul for staging this virtual London edition of the Khushwant Singh Lit Fest. The last time it was here in London was in 2019, and we all hope it will return soon. It's a great pleasure to be introducing the session in the festival because I met Khushwant when I first moved to Delhi for the Financial Times in 1983, and later I lived in the stylish Sujan Singh Park mansion flats close to his and Raul's homes. Khushwant was always entertaining and full of wit and comment. His books helped me as a journalist to understand India and relations with Pakistan, which brings us neatly to the 2 books that we're discussing today, both personal memoirs of life with Benazir Bhutto. Benazir was the world's first Muslim woman to be Prime Minister, a post she held twice between 1988 and 1996. I got to know her in the mid-1980s before she became Prime Minister, briefly in London and when she was living in Karachi. So it's fascinating to be introducing these 2 sessions. London-based Victoria Schofield, a longtime friend of Benazir from their days at Oxford, and Javed Jabbar in Pakistan, a politician and minister in her government. The books are very different. Both, as I said, are memoirs. Neither sets out to be a complete biography, nor a chronicle of her 2 governments and policies. Victoria's book, The Fragrance of Tears, which I reviewed for my Riding the Elephant blog and for the Commonwealth Roundtable Journal, is just out as a paperback, having come out as a hardback last year. Victoria is a historian and author, including books on Kashmir, one just updated and republished, a biography on Lord Wavell, and a history of the British Army's Black Watch. She's written a discreet personal memoir. My Friendship with Benazir Bhutto is the subtitle. They knew each other for 33 years, and this is a personally sympathetic picture of a woman who had a sense of duty and, increasingly, of dynasty. Senator Javed Jabbar, as well as being a writer, has been an ad man, a politician, a scholar, and an artist and a mass communications expert. In what he describes as a personal political memoir and a personal narrative, he writes as a politician who served with and under Benazir as her information minister. He is, if I might say so, somewhat less discreet than Victoria, though quite blunt on the key subject of corruption. Titled Buck Prime Minister, Interactions 1986 to 2000 with Benazir Bhutto, is one of a series of 5 books Javed is writing about his time in politics. I heard him explain the Buck Prime Minister title when the book was launched at a Pakistan-based Zoom session earlier this week. And I'll leave it to him to explain what he says in the book and how that title came about. It's a good title. Javed and Victoria, over to you.
Thank you, John, for that very warm and gracious introduction. It's a privilege to be with you and with the star of the afternoon, evening, Victoria Schofield. Hi, Victoria.
Hi, Javed. Good to talk to you in Lahore.
And thank you, Ashwani Saab, Abalani Saab, Nilofer and Rahul and the whole team for bringing this together. It's a privilege to be part of the Khushwant Singh Literature Festival, virtually meeting today. And I want to begin by paying a humble, brief tribute to the extraordinary individual after whom this festival is named. He was exceptionally forthright, he was blunt, he was candid, he was irreverent, he was indiscreet, sometimes unduly so, with names particularly. But what a life, beginning with virtual indolence, inability to make it in law, and then very quickly graduating into the foreign service, into the public domain, into journalism, and then as an independent, outspoken, inimitable intellectual who's left us with this remarkable legacy of an autobiography called Truth, Love, and a Little Malice, which I'm now rereading and enjoying thoroughly every page that I go. I just want to quickly refer to 2 episodes. First, he was a very dear friend of both my late in-laws, Sayyid Rashid Ahmad, pioneer broadcaster of All India Radio, and my mother-in-law, a pioneer women's educationist. And I had the honor of being with him at dinner at their residence in Karachi. And secondly, a very bizarre episode which occurred. Khushwant Singh and I were together at a Rotary conference in Karachi. And as I began to speak on Indo-Pak relations, I think Khushwant Singh was really heading to respond to the call of nature. But I couldn't resist it. So I said, there it is. Now, this is a distinguished Indian who does not want to listen to a Pakistani, undistinguished Pakistani, at which Khushwant, of course, turned right back, very embarrassed, and sat down, for which I'll be always grateful to him. So great to remember him. Here we are with Victoria Schofield, a truly extraordinary woman, a woman born in Europe, thoroughly British, highly educated, elected president of the Oxford Union, a very early friendship with Benazir Bhutto, takes this bold decision to respond to Benazir's invitation, not at the best of times, but at perhaps the worst of times, 1978, when Benazir's father is facing virtual death. And she goes out there and accumulates and builds upon this friendship, on which we will hear much more and much better from her. But I just want to say that the fragrance of tears is really a testament to the concept and the practice of true friendship. Solidarity without any conditions. Solidarity of affirmation and bonding. It is a physical and verbal and emotional support process friendship without any preconditions. And the book is a beautiful portrait that deliberately looks at the strengths and the virtues of Benazir and chooses not to look at the blemishes, which is fine. There's no complaint with that, but that's just an unavoidable observation. And the book, at the same time, is not a monotonous eulogy of Benazir. It's a hard, fact-based, evidence-based narrative of what actually happened. So it is not wishful, it's not a wishful fantasy. So may I begin by asking Victoria, how did you conceptualize and write this book? What was the process which you followed? Was it instinctive? Was it staggered? How did you see that experience?
Well, thank you so much, Javed. And thank you, of course, everyone at the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival for inviting me to speak about this book, which it really is, for me, as well as being a personal memoir of a friendship, it was very challenging to write. And in answer to your question, Javed, I had it in mind to write it. Perhaps I always knew I would write it right from the start. I don't know. But particularly in 2007, when I was with her on the first attempt on her life, when she returned to Pakistan in October 2007. And I spent a further week in Pakistan, and I was staying with her in Bilawal House in Karachi. And it somehow flashed across my mind that we'd had this extraordinary friendship, and I somehow wanted to document for our children, and I've dedicated the book to my 3 children and to her 3 children, the consequences of meeting someone and how a friendship continues in, as you rightly say, it began in very good times. I've called that first chapter Our Salad Days when we were students at Oxford, but then it turned into the worst of times. And I felt that had we perished, both of us on that bus, that terrible day, that truck, I just wanted to leave something for the children, for posterity. But to be honest, when she actually was assassinated, I set it aside. It was, as I've put in the narrative now, the events were too raw. It was too painful. And I really couldn't continue with it. I didn't want to continue with it. A lot of people were saying, oh, you know, you should write on Benazir. And a lot of people were writing about their friendship and all the rest of it. But I got busy doing something else, and I was happy to be busy doing something else, which was writing the military history of the Black Watch, the British Army Regiment. And it was only after I'd finished that and had a bit of repose that I felt now is the time that I must do it. And it was a compulsion. I'm actually very glad I've done it. Instead of thinking, should I, shouldn't I? I'm very glad I've done it. But it's not an easy thing to do write on a friend. That I'd underline.
Sorry, Victoria, I was struck by the fact that even at a time when you perhaps didn't plan to write this book, you didn't know what the outcome of this friendship, how it would end, at least in terms of her life. You began to collect mementos, the entry pass into the Supreme Court. You made sketches of the Supreme Court judges and their attendant. That's charming. And Mr. Bhutto himself. So you were accumulating material even without planning a book at that stage.
And that material, of course, helped me enormously. I'm actually, that's probably the journalist in me. I tend not to throw things away, and I keep things because I recognize the value of primary sources. And it was my mother actually who kept all my letters home, and I did keep diaries. And these are all I got out. I mean, I was looking at material I hadn't looked at for 40 years, which was extraordinary. Even the notes that Mr. Bhutto himself had scribbled to me on bits of paper coming out of the Rawalpindi Central Jail. And what I wanted to do above all was to write something that would be read by the reader as authentic. And hence I used the historian in me to document that this wasn't just a sort of vague recollection, that there was this documentary evidence. Because I felt that was important, knowing how difficult it is to write on a friendship. You don't want it to turn it into a eulogy, you don't want to turn it into hagiography. I think particularly what I wanted to capture for people who, even such as yourself, Javed, in your book, you knew her in a political capacity when she was Prime Minister. But what I wanted to spend time on was that terrible decade, starting with the year I spent in Pakistan in 1978-79 with the execution of her father. To show, because almost you can't parachute into Benazir Bhutto's life without understanding what gave her that courage, what gave her that resilience, what gave her that determination.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I was privileged, which is another reason why I felt I must write the book.
Yeah.
To be a witness to that.
Absolutely. But I want to come back. I want to come back to the unacknowledged role, perhaps not. It should be more acknowledged than it perhaps is, because Benazir Bhutto is the huge public persona. But there is this Victoria Schofield sitting down to write. As a fellow writer, I just want to know, for the benefit of everyone who joined, what was the physicality of it? Was the writing compressed into staggered phases, or was it continuous, uninterrupted? How did you do that?
I started the first line on New Year's Day, 2019, I think.
My God! Oh, fantastic!
And on the assumption that this was now going to be a published book. What I'd written before, which was accounts of the trial and everything, that had been just notes and sort of passing paragraphs and chapters, and almost like an essay.
Right.
But I began in serious. I mean, there was no going back when I wrote that first line. And that first line, I was on a train. And I start the book with the narrative of when I heard of her assassination. And I think she is someone that, you know, those of us who knew her, you do remember, like a big event, like you remember when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, where you were when 9/11 took
absolutely
place. And I think those people who cared about it didn't. And I was on a train. Somehow, having written that first sentence, the rest of it flowed. I just carried on. And I carried on continuously with the Oxford chapter, the Oxford days. I wanted to give a flavor of what she was like as a student, and how our friendship developed, which was being in the same college. And I vividly remember meeting her. Often you forget the first time you've met people, but I remember the first time I met her. I had no idea she would make such a huge impact on my life. I had no idea. I feel so dramatic. But so that was, I just kept going. But I had to go back to the documents I'd stored away. In the court case, I had to revisit the trial of her father, the appeal, which I'd attended.
Absolutely.
Just collect the little fragments of letters and memories and everything.
I know. But the crucial initial phase, Victoria, this empathy or this rapport that you found with Benazir, do you think it was intangible, it was instinctive? Was there something chemical or cerebral, or was it spiritual? Did you feel an affinity with this woman with whom you had very little in common in terms of ethnicity or heritage or geography or history? What is it that you think brought you closer to her, and vice versa?
Well, you're right. And I think the big transition was, of course, going to Pakistan in 1978. The initial friendship, she had hundreds of friends at Oxford. She was very popular. You know, she zoomed around in her yellow MGB sports car, which so many people have written about. She was very popular. But I think the transition, and it did signify a change in a way in me, a growing up, that I decided to go to Pakistan. I have to say, for viewers in the present day, I had no idea what I was going into. And in fact, I was so naive, because Benazir was the only Pakistani I'd ever met. I thought I was going to a hot country. So I arrived in a T-shirt and a short skirt. You know, we were clueless, because also we were not as involved as we are now with trying to understand different cultures. And, well, she, you know, always dressed appropriately at Oxford. She didn't sort of overlay the culture element. Again, we've got to think we're in the 70s. It's pre the Iranian Revolution. It's pre the fashion which came back, you know, very much for women to cover their heads with a veil. But equally, the other thing was the lack of technical equipment to communicate. I arrived there with a notepad and a camera, an Instamatic camera. now we can file our articles online. We've got all the, facilities possible to communicate. I was essentially taking this huge step into the unknown. And I suppose, to answer your question, Javed, it was that force of personality and that in a way schoolgirl friendship which had developed, student friendship, that I thought Benazir's in trouble and off I go. She was keen for other people to go as well, lawyers, etc. I wasn't a lawyer, but they were in their jobs. They didn't have the time available. But I was sort of in an in-between stage, and I just thought I'd go. I hesitate to add, I thought I would go for 4 or 5 weeks, the length of the appeal. Nobody thought the appeal would go on for the year that it did. But looking back on it, I realized how desperately naive I was. And but it brought me, what I will say for listeners everywhere in South Asia and indeed throughout the world, I wouldn't change it for anything. It gave me such an understanding. It opened so many doors. And I often say to people, she was the only person I knew in Pakistan. She was under house arrest at that time. But through her and through that friendship and through her induction of me into Pakistani society, I now feel as comfortable there as I do in my own home. And I have so many friends. And, I do get people, and we're all aware of the reputation Pakistan sometimes has,
an undeserved reputation, a distorted reputation.
And they say, "Oh, you're off to Pakistan." I go, "Yes, lovely." And they say, "Oh, aren't you afraid?" And I go, "No." Accidents can happen anywhere. I mean, you can anything can happen there. So it's I think that's why it is a testament, and again, that's what the important strand I want people to take from in the book is this cross-cultural link at a time when we're all kind of retreating into our own little sort of corners of nationality, and you don't want to have friends of a different faith, and you can't hear any different arguments, and etc., etc. To me, it's been the most valuable, influential aspect of my life.
Victoria, what strikes me is that there is a perversity to the credit that should be given to a martial law regime that was bent on assassinating that prime minister, that they allowed the friend of the daughter of this gentleman to stay on in Pakistan. I mean, they could have easily said, just get on a flight and get the heaven out of our country. But actually, you were able to stay for several months. And
yes, I stayed for almost a year. I mean, it was a bit curious. I have to, again, I do have to say that we had no requirement for visas in those days. I just turned up. There was no visa requirement, which comes into play in my later story. So therefore, I didn't have to ask permission or anything. I just came, and I think I was under surveillance, which was again extraordinary, to be honest, for a foreigner to be put under 24-hour surveillance by, I'm not sure who there were 2 cars with 2 men, and they used to follow me. The objective being to try and, I think, embarrass other people that they didn't want me to meet them. It was to try and restrict my movements. But they did put up with me and allow me to stay and allow me to visit her. It was with difficulty. I had to get permission. I had to bring up the Home Secretary, and there are various stories about going to stay. But again, I feel that was another privilege. I was the only foreigner, non-family member who saw her just before her father was executed. But when I tried to go back 2 years later, I was working for BBC, and I was actually coming to India. I was making a series of programs for the BBC radio programs, and I was intending to go and visit her for the weekend. That's when I did get forbidden entry, and I've written about it in the book, and it was, I suppose, quite dramatic because the order that I insisted upon seeing when they said I couldn't come into the country, I was landing in Karachi, was that I was to be banned from entering by land, sea, or air. And that order had been passed after I left in 1979. So it was a curious experience. And I think, again, for Indian listeners, and I sometimes do get accused of being a bit pro-Pakistan. I'm very pro-Pakistan, but I'm also very pro-South Asian, and I'm very pro-India because I got deported back to India, and soon afterwards I was due to have an interview with Indira Gandhi, and I was terrified the interview would be cancelled because of the so-called International Institute. The first thing she said to me was, you know, so they did not allow you into Pakistan, and I said, no, Prime Minister, I'm afraid not. She said, never mind, you're welcome here in India. So I've always said that, you know.
Before I put the next query to you, Victoria, would you like to share some passages from your book briefly, because you've written it in such an elegant way. It's emotional without being in any way hysterical, if I may. Hysterical is too extreme, but it is a very touching, very engaging way you have written it. So would you like to share with those who have not yet read the book some of the passages? I mean, you know, yeah, please do.
I think one passage I would like to read, actually, which does explain the title as to why I called it The Fragrance of Tears, is actually end. I mean, I'm not going to give any spoilers because we all know that she was assassinated. And I wanted to go to her grave. Again, this is, I mean, maybe this is where the spiritual element of the friendship comes in. I felt I had been to the family graveyard many times. I'd been there with her, but I wanted to go back to where she was resting. And it wasn't until 2010, 2010, that I was able to find the time to go. And I would like to read that passage. I think it does. Nearly 2 years later, when I was in Karachi in 2010, I determined to go to Gari Khuda Bakhsh to visit Benazir's grave. With the PPP government in power, Asif, her husband, had become president of Pakistan in succession to Musharraf. Although I could have taken a commercial flight to Saqqa, he had put the chief minister of Sindh's plane at my disposal. But it developed a technical fault before takeoff, and so I made the 250-mile journey from Karachi by helicopter. Passing at low altitude over the parched desert of Sindh, we approached the lands watered by the irrigation system of the Indus River as it stakes its way onwards towards Karachi, a patchwork of fields spread out beneath me. Finally, from the helicopter, for the first time, I saw the white-domed mausoleum, looking like a modern Taj Mahal. As soon as the helicopter landed, I went directly to the mausoleum. On entering, I took off my shoes, relishing the cool of the marble on my hot feet. Passing under an archway, I found myself looking at a gigantic portrait of Benazir. It was not a family birth or death anniversary when thousands traditionally converge. And so, with the exception of some villagers who'd come in from the fields and a few attendants, the mausoleum was empty. When I approached, one of the attendants came forward to offer me a basket of rose petals to scatter. Benazir's grave, covered in a red velvet cloth, was next to her father's, which now had an ornate marble canopy. As I grasped a handful of rose petals, I thought again of my first visit to Gari Khuda Bakhsh over 30 years ago, when Benazir and I had stood side by side in the open air by the graves of her ancestors. The triumphs and tragedies of the future as yet unknown. Now she lay with them. And then the final quotation is the poem. The sorrowful smell of the mist lingering over the Indus, gentle waves of rice, dung and rind. 'Tis the salt cry of Sindh. As I die, let me feel the fragrance of tears. And that's the great Sindhi poet Shah Abdul Latif, to whose poetry she introduced me to.
So, I mean, that passage, even though it is the last part of the book, I think it so well symbolizes, it summarizes the tone that you use throughout. And I'm reminded of another aspect of your visit when you chose to go to the site of her assassination. And I remember you writing that the sun was out and there were some people strolling about and there were one or two symbols of her presence there. So throughout the book, you have maintained a very even-handed kind of, attitude to describing a relationship that was so intense and close to you. And that brings me to ask Victoria whether the proximity to Benazir in some way prevented you from taking a larger view. And I'm not trying to look for the negatives or trying to be hypercritical. I realize that this is a book written with affection and bondage and love for another human being. So there is this tendency amongst people to say, oh, you have to take a balanced view. Of course, balance is beautiful, but sometimes balance can also be unfair, because people like to think in a very engaging way with individuals that they love, regardless of their other flaws. But do you think that your proximity in any way impeded a larger picture of Benazir? Did it?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right, Javed. I did not set out to write her biography, which would have been, as you say, the balanced view. Yeah. I have written biographies. I'm aware of the trades, the tools of the trade in terms of writing a biography. Yeah. But I did have people saying, "Oh, you should write her biography. You're so close to her. You do a really good job on a biography." I would not do a good job on a biography because I don't think it's fair for a biographer to have been as close as I was. But what I lost in terms of the biography, I gained in terms of the insights and the proximity. And that was what I felt was important. And I thought it was much better to do that rather than really do a half-baked biography, which would have not really been, would have, as they've been unsatisfactory from all points of view. Of course, as a friend, it's you can't suddenly take a step back. But I saw the challenges she faced. I mean, as I say, for example, when she became the first prime minister for the first time, she was 35 years old. She only just got married. She just had a baby. Huge expectations because of that 11-year period under General Zia were placed upon her. Everybody thought it's Christmas. They suddenly thought, they're going to get all the jobs they want, having had that very restrictive period of martial law. And that, therefore, I think, what I tried to convey was the real difficulties she faced with a lack of inexperience. I mean, the piles of files she had to go through. But I wasn't in government, and it wasn't fair for me to be, sort of trying to evaluate, as the way you indeed have done, Javed, because you, in your book, But Prime Minister, which I managed to read through, before our sessions, you have been very conscious of the fact that you're a political memoir and you're writing politically because you're within. You were able to see the bigger picture from within. So I think that's my answer to that.
Very nice of you to say that, but let's not detract from your book, because I just want to ask Victoria, over the 3 decades that you knew each other, did you two evolve, you think, simultaneously as people, change, or was it separately and you became someone else in some respects, not in your friendship with Benazir, but looking back over 33 years or plus, how did you see the change in her? What were the principal points that you think did not exist in the salad days? And
well, I mean, we both obviously matured, and I think, I'm really glad we had the salad days, because her life after that was just nothing but challenge. And, interestingly, one of the things that we used to do in the dreadful times when I would go and visit her in house arrest when her father was with his appeal was being heard before he was executed, was we would sort of reminisce, and the huge interest she had in what so-and-so was doing and who'd got married, whose job was everything. And these Oxford friends, as they're called, they appear as a sort of sub-theme throughout my narrative. And it's not because it was sort of any degree of self-importance about the Oxford Friends, but for readers to understand that it was among the Oxford Friends she'd been the happiest, and she could just relate back to them. And she wasn't, just because she'd suddenly become prime minister didn't mean she wasn't interested in ordinary people who were doing ordinary things. And I think, it was another side of her character that she never lost interest in the Oxford Friends. She loved knowing. And I mean, sometimes she'd get me to say, well, what's so-and-so doing? And I'd say, well, I have no idea. They kind of disappeared off. Oh, no, please find out. I want to know. So I think she drew strength from that. But we did both evolve. And to answer your question accurately, I think she had that, as I say, thrust into the limelight almost too soon after she got married. I mean, she had that very difficult time of nearly 5 years, either in jail or under house arrest. She was just beginning to get sort of her emotional life organized and have a child. And then suddenly she's thrust into this superstar celebrity position where everybody is wanting things from her. And the society in Pakistan, I sometimes felt a bit like Gulliver with all the Lilliputians pulling at her, wanting this and wanting that. And of course, then she had the, that sort of period in office, out of office, in office, out of office. And then she had the period of exile. But what I think the biggest tragedy is that I can't fully answer your question because she was assassinated age 54. And we'll never know. We'll never know part of her life. And I do believe that at 54, she had grown into a mature woman. She'd begun to understand, as we all did, what was going on in the 21st century. You read back on her speeches and the threat of international terrorism. And one of the things I did when I was writing the book was go back and listen to some of her speeches and indeed interviews. And she was very prescient. And the last speech she gave in 1996 at the General Assembly in the United Nations in New York, she said at an important day. So we just lost, this huge individual, which I feel tragic, is tragic for Pakistan and indeed for the world.
My last principal question before we open it up for discussion with participants and a few minutes perhaps at that other book which someone else has written. But the last main question I want to put to you is, knowing her as well as you did, and you yourself possessing very distinct thoughts on the subject, how do you view the evolution of democracy, both in Europe and the United Kingdom, and in South Asia, with reference to the emergence of populism, of disinformation, of what I think is non-representative electoral systems represented by the first past the post system, where people who secure a minority of votes get to represent the whole 100% electorate. Overall, do you think Benazir also was changing her views of how democratic institutions need to be refined, amended, improved? And your views also on the democratic process today?
Well, thank you, Javad. That's a challenging question to conclude with, but I will attempt to do my best. I think I will start almost at the beginning with my own history teacher who told me there's no such thing as a democracy. There's a republic or a constitutional monarchy with democratic principles, and it depends how democratic those principles are. And I think we in the West, and this is universal, we fall victim to sort of sound bites and platitudes in a way, and we talk about a democracy. And quite frankly, without education, we cannot possibly have a working democracy. And I think it's a process, and it's a process we are continuing to evolve to, and we are also in the Western world taking steps backwards. And I think we can have a sort of seminar on democracy, but the advent of social media, as I say, the sound bites, the lack of informed debate, the inability that we are seeing, and this is something that certainly disappointed me in my adult life compared with my student life, of not wanting to see the other side of the opinion, not wanting to create this, safe space, so to speak, so that you are not offended by hearing someone else's viewpoints with which you think might not agree. This is absolutely contrary to everything Benazir and I witnessed and had to put into practice in the Oxford Union debating chamber. We absolutely had to take motions, and it was probably the best instruction. And again, we had this always in common. We'd come from that stable, so to speak, of the Oxford Union. We had to take subjects, tricky subjects, debates, and we as students had to present an argument for or against. We couldn't suddenly say, I'm sorry, I don't want to talk on that side. The guest speakers obviously could choose which side they spoke on. But this we've all moved away from, and we've only got to see what happens. You know, as I say, it's not anything particular to Pakistan or India or Afghanistan. It's many countries throughout the world. You're getting this supposedly democracy, but it's rubber stamping an individual just by saying you've had an election. So I think we should all be alert to this, but without education, you know, we were always taught about the contented fool and the discontented philosopher. Once you know more, you have an opinion. And again, another very interesting speech Benazir gave, which was in Oxford, in the Oxford Union as a speaker. It was in, I think, 2006 before she went back. And she actually coincidentally happened to be speaking on the day that we were having a general election in the United Kingdom. And again, I've quoted bits of that speech in my book because it bears listening to again. She's talking, she's recognizing these difficulties. And I think she did. As I say, one of the challenges is that, you know, nobody wants to talk about the sort of small print. They want just to have the sound bites. And it's a challenge for all of us. So I hope I've done justice to that question. It's tricky. It needs a lot more time.
Certainly. No, thank you very much. And John, are you going to handle this part of it about fielding questions from participants who are listening?
No, I think our other colleague is who we saw.
All right, sorry.
We saw earlier, but otherwise, why don't you just pick them up from the them up from the private chat point and choose the questions that you want to ask.
I had one question which was posed about what, in one's opinion, was her strongest feature and what was her weakest. And of course, the temptation is to let Victoria go first so that I can then follow in her footsteps. But
I think you should indeed make your comments, Javed.
All right.
I will.
All
I'll
right.
be very, very brief. I think her strongest characteristic was her courage.
Yeah.
And if you want me to talk about weaknesses, I think she was almost too nice to people.
Very well said.
Very
Very well said. Thank you, Victoria. I think, yes, her strongest point was her ability to take on a misogynist culture in politics, despite the fact that we had the sister of the founder of Pakistan, Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah's sister Fatima Jinnah, had been a candidate against President Ayyub, a military leader, and had fought bravely. There was an example, Begum Rana Liaquat Ali Khan. But she, as a woman, came in at a time when 11 years of Ziaul Haq's rule had really made it into a very patriarchal, male-dominated, militarist kind of milieu. And to have a woman take on the system and demonstrate that a woman can look them in the eye and challenge them with all the restrictions that applied to her. She had to balance relations with the military, with the so-called civil establishment, and make compromises. And for the first time, deal with a hostile government in Punjab, the largest province. No leader in the history of our country had faced this. And to do it as a woman was, I think, her greatest achievement. Even if she failed spectacularly. And on sometimes failures are more important than successes. And her weakness, alas, and I'm not turning to this because it's so well known, because it has distracted attention from all the good things that she did or tried to do, which is her denial of the brutal reality of corruption, the ugly reality of corruption that did occur in the first government of which I was a part. And fortunately, I was not part of it, but there was that. And also in the second tenure. So that was her weak point. But let that not detract from the other questions that we might face from people who are wanting to put questions. So, Ashwani, is anyone there?
I do see this question, Javed, here, which I will answer just very quickly, just to put people's minds at rest. What the Indian Airlines pilot said to me when I was deported from Karachi back to Delhi in 1981, when I wasn't allowed into Pakistan. It's true. It was actually quite an episode because mistakenly they'd managed to let the plane that had brought me from Delhi take off, and Pakistani officials were rather annoyed at this because that would have meant there was no plane. It was late at night. There was no plane to take me back, and they actually called that plane back because it was still in Pakistan airspace to pick me up to go back to Delhi, and I was, of course, exhausted, and so were all the passengers who suddenly had to be turned round and got back again, land back in Karachi, and then go off again. And the Sikh, the pilot, he was a Sikh, actually, interestingly. I can see him now in my mind's eye. And he was sort of saying, "Where's the deportee? Where's the deportee?" And I think they thought they were going to have some really fierce person. I popped up, and he said, "What, this little girl is such a threat to General Zia. All my passengers in my plane has to be such inconvenience," because it literally was about 3 in by the time we all got into Delhi. So that's what he said, and it was, but it was, as I say, I was on my own. It was quite daunting to be deported. I'm not particularly proud of it, but I was welcome back in India. Around 87. I didn't manage to get back till then.
Okay, good. Well, just to intrude at this point with that other book written by a certain suspicious character called But Prime Minister, I just, without detracting from the beauty.
We do want to hear, Javed.
The fragrance of tears is aromatic, it is evocative, and that should be the focus of this session. But because both of us have written books, I just want to say, yes, it is a political memoir, but I'm struck by sometimes the proviso or the qualification that one is clearly a personal memoir, which it is, and one is a political memoir. And yet the two overlap, because obviously it's not possible to surgically separate a person from the political process to which that person belonged. My book covers a 14-year period, 86 to 2000. I did keep in touch with Benazir after 2000, but that was our last meeting. It has 3 parts. It has 52 chapters, some of them brief, and it looks at different facets. It's not only on the negatives, on the corruption, but different facets of the panoramic kind of experience I had with her, serving her government within the country, but also having the privilege of representing her at the United Nations to organize the World Summit for Children, which reflected her sense of compassion and support, and the great irony that after having been elected to co-chair this World Summit, and I was representing her as the personal representative, she was deprived of this honor because 5 weeks before the summit, the government was dismissed. But then there are other facets in the book that try to capture what it was like for her, her vulnerability. There is a chapter, brief, where she could not take the vitriol and the venom with which speeches were being made inside the National Assembly at that time. And parliamentarians enjoy immunity for what is said within Parliament. And it was so unfair to hear the very, very low kind of rhetoric. Rhetoric is to dignify. The low kind of terminologies that were hurled at her. and she literally, she had to, be comforted by Nahid Khan and for whatever little I could do. But one truly was moved at the spectacle of what she was facing. And then at the same time, Victoria, I mean, in the book, I try to say I was always struck by the grace and the dignity with which
I was about to say she had huge dignity.
Yeah.
She really, that posture she had, I think, was wonderful. And I would endorse, Javed, what you said and written, is that you cannot underestimate how difficult it was for her as a woman. I do feel that we in the West, again, we thought, well, we've got Margaret Thatcher, they've got Benazir Bhutto, everything's fine. Until but again, I saw it operate. I saw people refuse to shake her hand. I saw, the newspapers where the mullahs were preaching against her. And I think that, again, is something that we shouldn't underestimate. But she did set an example, because in the time before that, you didn't see women television presenters or doctors or lawyers the way you see them now. That's part of her legacy. That confidence. Immediately, it's the top of the pyramid. It's the people who are better educated. They all feel, they can do something. Yes, I can get to the top of my profession. And I think that was inspired by Benazir there. That fabulous photograph of her the first time she took the oath of office. We cannot.
Yes. Oh, I mean, literally the night before that, Victoria, I happened to be at the residence of Dr. Zafar Niazi, where she was staying. And the very belated call came from the presidency, asking her to come to the presidency to be told that she can go ahead and form the government. And she stepped out radiant. It was like a princess going out to be crowned queen the next day. And there was beauty in that, and there was dignity combined at that time. But, compared to today's environment, when we have so many channels which we introduced during General Musharraf's tenure, we had only state media. And I'm not trying to take undue credit for this, because when I put to her this proposal that we should open up state media to reporting the opposition every day, to my pleasant surprise, she agreed. It's another matter that the policy didn't last for 4 months. But during those 4 golden months, the credibility of PTV and Radio Pakistan shot up very high, thanks to her support. And they were allowed to say absolutely, completely fabricated statements, quoting the opposition leader Nawaz Sharif, saying Benazir Bhutto is taking the country towards atheism. Now, my God, that's sacrilegious. In a country that is so religious, you had the state media broadcasting this charge unedited on the main news bulletin. And she took it. She was very hurt and upset with me, but she allowed that to happen for at least 4 to 5 months. So a great combination of memories. And I hope that, there's also, because there are Indian participants today, I want to say, there's a chapter called A Secret Message from India, which I hope, forget all the other chapters, I hope that alone makes you go and waste your money by buying the book and reading about it.
Javed, it fits in with a question that we've got here, which maybe you should answer in terms of, I also have some insights in terms of what she wanted with India-Pakistan peace. And again, where Khushwant Singh came across my horizon was because he was so in favor of, India-Pakistan rapprochement. And so I think,
I refer to, No, Victoria, you brought that up because in July 1989, after having previously come for the SAARC summit, where Benazir Bhutto handled herself with extreme self-confidence, considering it was the first time she was interacting with other heads of state and government. When Rajiv Gandhi came back to Islamabad in July 89 for an official visit, they really came very close to creating a new initiative for peace.
Exactly, the dawn of a new era. And that wonderful photograph I've got in my book of her in December 88 when he'd come for SAARC, with both laughing, both young, children of post-partition era.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the same thing in July 89, it was unfortunately and I'm not trying to be parochial here, when he returned to New Delhi, the establishment in New Delhi did not endorse the scope to take it further. But that's another chapter. And I can see John Elliott now making sure that I completely shut off.
I think,
so that
Raoul, okay, Raoul, have you got a question? I think you have.
Yeah, I do. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
You can hear me. First, I'd like to thank Javed Bhai, if I may call you Javed Bhai, and Victoria Ben for having come here and addressed us. Fascinating session. There's a question I noticed that General Kamal Dawar has sent, and mine is associated with that. And it's basically about why, when there was so much hope when Benazir became Prime Minister, Rajiv Gandhi became Prime Minister of India, there was so much hope that the two countries, with these two young leaders who were really with the best of intentions and who had no baggage behind them, why did not India and Pakistan come closer together there? I know that Javed Bhai just now said that in India it was the establishment, but in Pakistan there must have also been something which prevented Benazir from reaching out to Rajiv Gandhi.
Well, she did reach out, but I think, again, I mean, we will both say that it was the establishment on both parts. You know, as we know, it's very difficult. You can have the intent, but moving forward, obstacles are placed, and then that moment of opportunity is lost. I think she put it very succinctly. She said, my government was dismissed, and then Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated, and then that dawn of the new era, which they really both hoped for.
But also, Victoria, but also simultaneously, in order to be a true patriotic Pakistani, I want to say that it was not so much the establishment in Pakistan, Rahul Saab. There was also the development of the situation in the Indian part of Kashmir. That became a completely new factor of uncertainty and destabilization that changed the perceptions on both sides of the border. We were wrongly accused of bringing it about, and we thought the Indians are not being considerate to. So there were several factors, but that was also a major reason why that momentum could not be sustained.
Yes, I agree, because the timing was such. And one of the byproducts of my friendship is that I have myself written extensively on Jammu.
Absolutely, you have. Yeah.
Thank you.
So John,
I think sadly I have to now do a vote of, well, very happily do a vote of thanks, but sadly begin to bring the session to a close. It's dawned on me that nobody has actually seen what the books look like. So that's Victoria.
Oh no, that's Victoria's book. Absolutely,
and I've got Javed's on my iPad. And that now he's got his there. Yeah. It's been fascinating. It was marvelous to hear Victoria describe at the beginning how she came to write the book and her involvement. And when I read it and reviewed it, I thought those early parts were some of the most fascinating, when you were there during the trial of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and how you then got involved, arriving, as you said, in a T-shirt and shorts. I can imagine the
skirt.
Short. Sorry, I thought it was short. Anyway, even better. It was a brave visit, as you said. Javed's been very generous with his time, and his book is a fascinating read. I was just flicking through it while the session was going on, and at one or two points, or several points, he gets round to the same human side that you do, Victoria. There's a chapter called Tears Soon After the Cheers, which is when she's under attack in Parliament and from everybody. And he says, notwithstanding her fully adult age and her official stature of seniority, in those brief minutes I felt she was like one's younger sister, suffering deep inner pain. Cultural and social norms did not permit me the instinctive urge to reach out with an arm to her shoulder to comfort her. I only mumbled words to the effect, I'm very sorry, Prime Minister, we're all with you. So, Javed, you've got the same emotions for her that Victoria shows in her book.
Yes,
You've got a lot of politics as well. You make a marvellous tribute to her, which I was going to throw out as a question if there'd been a lull in the questions, which was a leader of global caliber, you say, and not just a daughter of the East. And there was a question about Daughter of the East, because of course that brings back memories of her of the book that she wrote.
yes.
Anyway, I think we've had a splendid conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Raoul, for popping up and having a question too.
Yeah.
And thank you to the audience who've stayed with us and all the people who've sent questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's now my duty to say to everybody, please stay with us for the next and final session of the day that starts in just under, I think, 30 minutes. 3:30 UK time, 8 p.m. in India, 10:30 over in the US East Coast. The topic is the Granddaughter Project, with Syed Shaheen Christie as the speaker and Divya Dutta as the interviewer, recounting major events in history through stories of women, celebrating, of course, Khushwant Singh's interest in empowering the girl child and women worldwide. Thank you all very much, and from me, bye-bye.
Thank you, John. Thank you,
Thank you.
John.
Sorry, I lost myself
Thank you.
out.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
John. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.